Welcome to History Central, the channel where we travel back in time to explore the lives, the journeys, and the legacies of figures who changed the world forever. In today's epic documentary, we embark on a voyage across centuries to uncover the true story of one of history's most controversial and influential explorers, Christopher Columbus. From his humble beginnings in Genoa to his daring voyages across the Atlantic, from the glory of discovery to the shadows of conquest, this is the full story of Christopher Columbus. Chapter 1. Birth and Childhood in Genoa. Christopher Columbus was born in the bustling port city of Genoa, in what is now Italy, between August and October of the year 1451. The exact date remains uncertain, as records from the mid-15th century were not always carefully preserved. Yet historians agree that he entered the world at a time when Europe was stirring with new energy, invention, and ambition, the early days of the Renaissance. The Genoa of Columbus's childhood was a city of contrasts: crowded alleys, merchants shouting in the markets, the smell of salt carried by the wind from the Mediterranean. Ships arrived daily, heavy with goods from distant lands, silks from the East, spices from India, and precious metals from Africa. Young Christopher, known in Italian as Cristoforo Colombo, grew up in an environment where the sea was not only a livelihood, but a gateway to dreams and possibilities. His father, Domenico Colombo, was a wool weaver by trade, and his mother, Susanna Fontanarassa, came from a modest but hard-working family. They were not wealthy, and Columbus's childhood was far from luxurious. He was the eldest of 5 children, and like many children of Genoese families, he was expected to help with his father's business from an early age. But young Cristoforo's eyes were always drawn to the sea. The harbor fascinated him far more than the loom. Accounts suggest that Columbus had some formal schooling, learning the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. More importantly, he was exposed to geography, astronomy, and navigation, subjects that were essential in a city so tied to maritime trade. Genoa's libraries contained works by ancient scholars such as Ptolemy, as well as new maps and charts brought by sailors from across the Mediterranean. The boy studied these eagerly, planting the seeds of the explorer he would become. By the time he was 14, Columbus was already going to sea. He served as a cabin boy on trading ships, learning firsthand the skills of seamanship, how to handle ropes, read the stars, and survive storms. These early voyages were not glamorous adventures, but harsh apprenticeships. Sailors faced constant danger, piracy, shipwrecks, and disease. Yet Columbus thrived. He gained experience sailing to faraway places such as the Aegean Sea, Northern Europe, and even as far as Iceland, according to some reports. This was also an age when stories of distant lands fired the imagination of every young mariner. Tales of Marco Polo's travels in Asia, with its riches of silk, spices, and gold, circulated widely. For Columbus, the idea that there might be a faster, direct route to those treasures across the Western Ocean became an obsession that would shape his destiny. But before that dream could take form, Columbus had to survive the trials of youth. Around 1476, while on a voyage to England, his ship was attacked by pirates off the coast of Portugal. The vessel went up in flames, and Columbus reportedly survived by clinging to a piece of wreckage and swimming to shore, a desperate struggle that ended with him crawling onto the sands of Portugal. This near-death experience would prove pivotal, for it brought him to the very country that was at the forefront of maritime exploration. Portugal in the late 15th century was the Silicon Valley of navigation. Prince Henry the Navigator had established schools of seamanship, and Portuguese explorers were pushing ever farther down the coast of Africa, opening new trade routes. Here, Columbus honed his skills, studied the winds and currents of the Atlantic, and began to develop the bold idea that would define his life: sailing west to reach the riches of Asia. By his late 20s, Columbus had transformed from a Genoese wool weaver's son into a seasoned sailor, chartmaker, and ambitious dreamer. But he still lacked something crucial: the means to turn his dream into reality. That struggle would consume the next decade of his life. Chapter 2. Dreams of the Ocean. Columbus's time in Portugal was both an education and an awakening. Living in Lisbon, he married Filipa Moniz Perestrello, the daughter of a respected Portuguese navigator. Through this marriage, he gained access to maps, charts, and the accumulated knowledge of explorers who had sailed along Africa's coast. He studied winds, ocean currents, and the techniques of navigation with relentless focus. The central question of Columbus's life was this: could one reach Asia by sailing west, across the uncharted Atlantic? The prevailing belief of the time was that the world was larger than Columbus estimated, and that a voyage westward would be far too long and dangerous. Most scholars agreed that Asia could only be reached by sailing eastward, around Africa, as the Portuguese were already attempting. But Columbus believed otherwise. He was convinced the Earth was smaller than commonly thought, and that Asia lay much closer to Europe than the map suggested. If he was right, a daring westward voyage could outflank the Portuguese, giving Spain or any other backer a monopoly on the lucrative spice trade. To support his theory, Columbus relied on a mix of careful study and creative interpretation. He read the works of classical geographers like Ptolemy, but he also seized upon more obscure sources that seemed to back his ideas. He gathered stories from sailors who claimed to have seen land far to the west, perhaps the islands of the Caribbean, or even parts of the Americas glimpsed accidentally. He believed these tales were evidence that Asia was within reach. For more than a decade, Columbus campaigned tirelessly to win support for his plan. He approached the Portuguese crown, but they dismissed him. He turned to Genoa and Venice, his homeland's powers, but they too rejected him. Again and again, Columbus faced ridicule and scorn. Most considered his plan not only impractical but absurd. Yet Columbus was nothing if not persistent. He had a stubborn confidence in his vision. He spoke of divine inspiration, of a destiny placed upon him by God to open new lands to Christendom. Whether out of faith, ambition, or desperation, he refused to surrender his dream. In 1485, he moved to Spain, where he began petitioning the Catholic monarchs, Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon. At first, they too were unconvinced. Spain was embroiled in its final war against the Moors of Granada, and resources were stretched thin. Still, Columbus lingered at court, supported modestly by friends and religious patrons who admired his faith. It would take years and countless rejections before the tides of fortune turned in his favor. But Columbus never doubted. He walked the halls of monasteries and royal palaces with a conviction that he was destined to change the world. And in the end, that conviction carried him further than anyone could have imagined. Chapter 3. The Quest for Support. By the late 1480s, Columbus had spent years lobbying European courts. His persistence was remarkable. He presented his case to the Royal Council of Spain multiple times, each ending with rejection. The experts argued that Columbus's calculations were deeply flawed. The Earth was larger than he thought, and his voyage would end in disaster long before he reached Asia. But Columbus found allies among certain influential figures. At the monastery of La Rabida, he befriended the friar Juan Perez, a former confessor of Queen Isabella. Perez believed in Columbus's mission and arranged audiences with the royal court. Columbus also found patrons among wealthy merchants who stood to gain if his gamble succeeded. The turning point came in 1492, when Spain finally conquered Granada, ending centuries of Muslim rule in Iberia. With the war over, Isabella and Ferdinand turned their attention outward, toward new opportunities for glory and wealth. Columbus once again pressed his case, and this time, the monarchs listened more closely. Negotiations were tense. Columbus demanded not only funding for his voyage, but also titles and privileges, the rank of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, governorship over any lands he discovered, and a share of the profits. At first, these demands seemed outrageous, but in the end, Isabella and Ferdinand agreed. The monarchs, eager to compete with Portugal, decided to gamble on Columbus's vision. Thus, in April 1492, the capitulations of Santa Fe were signed, granting Columbus the support he had long sought. He was given 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and a crew of about 90 men. Supplies were gathered, prayers were offered, and the dream that had consumed Columbus for decades was about to be tested upon the vast, unknown ocean. Chapter 4. The First Voyage, 1492. On the morning of August 3, 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail from the port of Palos de la Frontera, The ships were small by modern standards. The Santa Maria, his flagship, was a modest carrack, while the Nina and Pinta were caravels, nimble but cramped. The men aboard were a mixture of sailors, adventurers, and convicts granted freedom in exchange for service. The voyage across the Atlantic was perilous. Weeks passed without sight of land. Supplies dwindled, and the crew grew restless. Rumors spread that they would never return. Columbus faced near mutiny several times, calming his men with promises and steadfast confidence. He kept 2 sets of logs, one accurate, the other understated, to reassure the crew that they had not traveled as far as they truly had. Then, in the early hours of October 12th, a cry came from the Pinta. Tierra! Tierra! Land had been sighted. Columbus and his men had reached an island in the Bahamas, which he named San Salvador. Believing he had reached the Indies, Columbus called the inhabitants Indians. Over the following weeks, Columbus explored the Caribbean, encountering the islands of Cuba and Hispaniola. He marveled at the lush landscapes, the unfamiliar animals, and the gold ornaments worn by the indigenous peoples. Convinced he had found the outskirts of Asia, he wrote enthusiastic letters to the Spanish crown, describing endless opportunities for wealth and conversion. But not all went smoothly. The Santa Maria ran aground on Christmas Day, forcing Columbus to leave behind a small settlement, La Navidad, on Hispaniola. When he finally returned to Spain in March 1493, he brought with him gold trinkets, exotic plants, and several indigenous captives. His arrival caused a sensation. The monarchs received him with triumph, and Europe buzzed with the news of his discovery. Chapter 4. The First Voyage, 1492. On the morning of August 3, 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail from the port of Palos de la Frontera. The ships were small by modern standards. The Santa Maria, his flagship, was a modest carrack, while the Nina and Pinta were caravels, nimble but cramped. The men aboard were a mixture of sailors, adventurers, and convicts granted freedom in exchange for service. The voyage across the Atlantic was perilous. Weeks passed without sight of land. Supplies dwindled, and the crew grew restless. Rumors spread that they would never return. Columbus faced near mutiny several times, calming his men with promises and steadfast confidence. He kept 2 sets of logs, one accurate, the other understated, to reassure the crew that they had not traveled as far as they truly had. Then, in the early hours of October 12th, a cry came from the Pinta. Tierra! Tierra! Land had been sighted. Columbus and his men had reached an island in the Bahamas, which he named San Salvador. Believing he had reached the Indies, Columbus called the inhabitants Indians. Over the following weeks, Columbus explored the Caribbean, encountering the islands of Cuba and Hispaniola. He marveled at the lush landscapes, the unfamiliar animals, and the gold ornaments worn by the indigenous peoples. Convinced he had found the outskirts of Asia, he wrote enthusiastic letters to the Spanish crown, describing endless opportunities for wealth and conversion. But not all went smoothly. The Santa Maria ran aground on Christmas Day, forcing Columbus to leave behind a small settlement, La Navidad, on Hispaniola. When he finally returned to Spain in March 1493, he brought with him gold trinkets, exotic plants, and several indigenous captives. His arrival caused a sensation. The monarchs received him with triumph, and Europe buzzed with the news of his discovery. Chapter 5. Return and Fame. Columbus returned to Spain as a hero. He was paraded through the streets, hailed as the man who had found a new route to the Indies. The monarchs granted him honors, titles, and riches. He was named Admiral of the Ocean Sea, as promised, and plans for a second, larger voyage began almost immediately. Europe was electrified by the news. Competing nations scrambled to claim their share of this new world. The Pope himself issued decrees granting Spain dominion over lands discovered west of a certain line, sparking tensions with Portugal. For Columbus personally, the triumph was intoxicating. After years of rejection and doubt, he had proven himself. Yet beneath the glory lay complications. His belief that he had reached Asia persisted, blinding him to the true scale of his discovery. The lands he had encountered were not the outskirts of China or India, but a completely new world. As Columbus basked in fame, preparations for the next voyage began. This time, it would not be a small exploratory mission, but a grand colonial enterprise, with 17 ships and over 1,000 men. The age of discovery had entered a new phase, and Columbus was at its center. Christopher Columbus, the man, the myth, the legacy. Chapter 6, The Second Voyage, 1493 to 1496. The triumph of Columbus's first voyage electrified Spain. The monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, saw not only glory but immense opportunity. This was no longer about exploration alone. It was about empire. In September 1493, Columbus embarked on his second voyage, this time commanding a fleet of 17 ships and more than 1,200 men. It was a staggering escalation from the tiny flotilla of his first journey. This was no longer an experiment. It was colonization. The fleet carried settlers, priests, soldiers, horses, and supplies to establish a permanent Spanish presence in the Caribbean. They also brought tools and weapons, along with the conviction that they were claiming lands not only for Spain but for Christendom. The cross would travel with the sword. Sailing westward, Columbus reached Dominica, Guadeloupe, and several other islands before returning to Hispaniola, where he had left the small settlement of La Navidad. But to his horror, the colony had been destroyed. The men left behind were dead, killed after clashes with the local Taino people. This was Columbus's first taste of the difficulties of colonization and a foreshadowing of greater tragedies to come. Despite this setback, Columbus pressed forward. He established a new settlement, Isabella, named after the Queen. Yet life there quickly turned grim. Food shortages, disease, and infighting plagued the colony. The relationship with the Taino soured as Spanish demands for food, gold, and labor grew harsh. The initial encounters of curiosity and cautious peace gave way to mistrust, exploitation, and violence. Columbus himself struggled with leadership. He was a gifted sailor and visionary, but he lacked the skills to govern restless settlers or manage complex social dynamics. Reports of cruelty, mismanagement, and chaos began to filter back to Spain. Still, Columbus pushed forward with exploration, traveling around Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and Cuba, always convinced he was on the threshold of Asia. By the time he returned to Spain in 1496, his reputation was beginning to fray. He had brought back little gold, and the colonies were plagued with hardship. Yet he retained the monarch's support, for now. The promise of riches was still too great to abandon. Chapter 7, The Third Voyage, 1498 to 1500. 2 years later, Columbus set out once again, this time with 6 ships. The goals were clear: find more direct routes to Asia, secure wealth, and restore order in the colonies. Sailing further south than before, Columbus reached the coast of present-day Venezuela in 1498. Here, he became the first European to encounter the South American mainland. The lush lands and wide rivers awed him, and for a brief moment, he recognized that this was not the Asia he had sought. He wrote of a terrestrial paradise, and speculated that perhaps he had reached the edge of the Garden of Eden itself. But back in Hispaniola, the situation was dire. The settlers were in open rebellion against Columbus's rule. They accused him of tyranny, corruption, and incompetence. The native population, once numbering in the millions, was already suffering devastating losses from disease, forced labor, and violence. The utopia Columbus had promised was unraveling into chaos. In 1500, the Spanish monarchs sent a royal commissioner, Francisco de Bobadilla, to investigate. Bobadilla sided with the rebels. Columbus and his brothers were arrested, shackled, and sent back to Spain in chains. It was a humiliating fall from grace for the man who had once been hailed as a hero. Yet Isabella and Ferdinand released him, restoring his freedom but stripping him of many of his titles. Columbus's dream of ruling vast territories as a noble viceroy was shattered. Still, he was not finished. He begged for one more chance to prove himself, one final voyage. Chapter 8, The Fourth Voyage, 1502 to 1504. In May 1502, at the age of 51, Columbus embarked on his fourth and final voyage. He commanded 4 ships, but his mission was no longer the grand colonization of earlier expeditions. Instead, he sought a passage to Asia through the waters of Central America, a strait that he believed must exist. The voyage was plagued from the start. His ships were battered by storms, worm-eaten, and barely seaworthy. Columbus and his crew explored the coasts of Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. They encountered indigenous peoples who alternated between cautious trade and fierce resistance. Columbus was convinced he was close to Asia, but no passage revealed itself. He endured hurricanes, hostile attacks, and dwindling supplies. At one point, 2 of his ships were lost, and the others barely held together. Finally, in 1503, Columbus and his men were stranded on the island of Jamaica. There, marooned for over a year, Columbus's leadership was tested as never before. Supplies ran out, and the men grew desperate. In a legendary moment of cunning, Columbus used his knowledge of astronomy to predict a lunar eclipse. He warned the local Jamaicans that his god would darken the moon if they did not provide food. And when the eclipse occurred, they were terrified and agreed to help. It was a triumph of intellect in the face of despair. At last, in 1504, rescue arrived. Columbus returned to Spain, aged, ill, and weary. His final voyage had brought no great riches, no passage to Asia, no new glory. It was the end of his oceanic odyssey. Chapter 9. Later Years and Death. The Columbus who returned to Spain in 1504 was not the triumphant hero of 1493. He was a man worn down by years at sea, by political battles, by disappointment. He suffered from gout, arthritis, and possibly writer's syndrome, leaving him in constant pain. Queen Isabella, his greatest patron, died that same year. With her death, Columbus lost his strongest supporter. King Ferdinand remained distant, granting Columbus a pension, but withholding the vast titles and governorships he had once promised. Columbus spent his final years in Valladolid, writing letters, petitions, and memoirs. He remained obsessed with his belief that he had reached Asia. He never accepted that the lands he had encountered were part of a new world. His writings were filled with biblical references and appeals to divine mission. He saw himself not just as an explorer, but as a chosen instrument of God. On May 20th, 1506, Christopher Columbus died in relative obscurity. He was about 55 years old. Few mourned him beyond his family and closest companions. He was buried in Valladolid, though his remains would later be moved several times, to Seville, then across the Atlantic, and perhaps finally to Santo Domingo in Hispaniola. The exact location of his bones remains disputed to this day, fittingly mysterious for a man who lived his life in pursuit of the unknown. Chapter 10. Legacy and Controversy. In the centuries after his death, Christopher Columbus became a symbol, celebrated by some, condemned by others. His voyages had unquestionably changed the course of history. They opened the way for Europe's exploration, conquest, and colonization of the Americas. They connected continents that had developed in isolation, sparking the Columbian Exchange, the transfer of crops, animals, technologies, and diseases that reshaped the world. For Europe, Columbus's discoveries ushered in an age of wealth and expansion. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, they marked the beginning of devastation, disease, slavery, cultural destruction, and colonization. Over time, Columbus was mythologized. Painters depicted him as a noble visionary. Nations celebrated him as a symbol of courage and discovery. In 1792, on the 300th anniversary of his first voyage, he was honored across Europe and the Americas. The United States named its capital's district after him, the District of Columbia. Statues were erected in his memory. Yet in recent decades, his legacy has come under fierce scrutiny. Historians and activists have pointed to the suffering of indigenous peoples under Spanish colonization, to the violence and enslavement that followed in the wake of his voyages. Columbus, once hailed as a hero, has also become a symbol of imperialism, oppression, and cultural loss. The debate continues. Was Columbus a daring visionary who changed the world? Or was he the harbinger of conquest and tragedy? The truth, as always, lies in complexity. He was a man of his time, ambitious, flawed, brilliant, stubborn. He did not discover a new continent alone, nor did he set out to destroy civilizations, but his actions unleashed forces that would reshape history forever. Today, more than 500 years later, Columbus remains one of the most controversial figures in history. His voyages remind us of humanity's thirst for discovery and its capacity for destruction. His story is not just about one man, but about the birth of the modern world, with all its wonders and all its wounds. And so, the story of Christopher Columbus ends where it began, with a dream of reaching distant lands, of finding riches and glory, of making a mark upon history. He did all of these things, though not always in the way he imagined. His voyages opened new worlds even as they ended old ones. He remains, 5 centuries later, a man both celebrated and condemned, a reminder that history is never simple, and that the legacy of discovery is forever intertwined with the legacy of loss. Thank you for joining us on this journey. This has been History Central, where the past comes alive. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more epic stories from history.